I need to tell you what happened in that courtroom. Not because I'm proud of it. Not because I want your sympathy. But because I need someone to understand what it feels like when a single moment, one breath, one choice, costs you everything you thought you knew about your own family. My name is Margaret. I'm 58 years old. And 3 weeks ago, I sat in a courtroom in Charlotte, North Carolina, and watched my brother lie under oath about our father's last words. The thing is, I was there when our father died. Thomas wasn't. But that didn't stop him from telling the judge exactly what Dad supposedly wanted. Let me go back. Our father was Wallace Henry Pritchard. You might not know the name unless you worked in commercial real estate development across the Carolinas and Virginia. He built strip malls, outlet centers, mid-sized distribution hubs. Not glamorous, not sexy, but over 43 years, he amassed a portfolio worth just over $2.4 billion. He never remarried after our mother died. He lived in the same house in Asheville, drove a 12-year-old truck, ate dinner at the same diner every Sunday after church. He was careful with money, careful with words, and he raised me and Thomas to understand that wealth is responsibility, not power. At least, I thought that's what he taught us. Thomas is 4 years older than me. He's always been the charmer, the one who could walk into a room and make people feel like they mattered. Dad loved that about him. I was the quiet one, the one who did the books, the legal reviews, the zoning research. I never minded. I loved the work. I loved being useful. But I think, somewhere deep down, I always knew Thomas saw me as the help. Dad got sick 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4 by the time they caught it. He lasted 19 months. Longer than anyone expected. I moved back to Asheville to take care of him. Thomas visited twice. Once for Thanksgiving. Once in February, for 3 days, because his wife Karen wanted to ski in Boone. I don't say that to make him sound bad. I say it because it's true. And because what happened later makes no sense unless you understand that. Dad died on a Tuesday morning in April. Hospice had been coming every day for 2 weeks. He was in and out of consciousness. But that morning, around 6, he opened his eyes. He looked right at me. And he said, "You've been good to me, Maggie." That's what he called me. Maggie. He squeezed my hand. Then he said, "Don't let them take it from you." I asked him what he meant. He closed his eyes. And 30 seconds later, he was gone. I sat there with him for almost an hour before I called anyone. I didn't cry right away. I just held his hand and tried to memorize his face. When I finally called Thomas, he didn't answer. I left a voicemail. He called me back 6 hours later. He was in a meeting. He said he'd fly in the next day. The funeral was small. Dad didn't want to fuss. We held it at the Presbyterian Church on Merriman Avenue. Maybe 60 people came. Mostly old business associates, a few neighbors, his sister Dorothy from Raleigh. Thomas gave the eulogy. It was beautiful. He talked about Dad's work ethic, his integrity, his quiet generosity. People cried. I sat in the front row and felt nothing. Not because I didn't love my father, but because I couldn't stop thinking about what Thomas had said to me the night before, in the hallway of Dad's house. We were going through papers, sorting documents for the estate attorney. Thomas picked up a folder and said, "You know Dad changed his will, right?" I said no. I didn't know that. Thomas smiled. Not a warm smile. A careful one. He said, "He did it last October, when you were out in Wilmington dealing with that warehouse issue." I asked what he changed. Thomas set the folder down. He looked me right in the eye. And he said, he split everything down the middle, 50-50, fair and square. I asked if Dad told him that. Thomas nodded. He said they'd talked on the phone about it. That Dad wanted to make sure there was no confusion. I didn't argue. I didn't even question it. I just said okay. Because why would my brother lie about something like that? The reading of the will happened the following Monday. Dad's estate attorney was a man named Robert Calhoun. He'd worked with Dad for 30 years. Office in downtown Asheville, old brick building, creaky floors. I sat on one side of the table. Thomas and Karen sat on the other. Robert opened the file, and he started reading. Dad's will was dated March 22nd, 5 weeks before he died. Not October. It was witnessed by 2 hospice nurses. And it was very, very clear. 70% of the estate went to me. 30% to Thomas. Robert read it slowly. I watched Thomas's face. He didn't move. Didn't blink. Karen's mouth opened slightly, but she didn't say anything. Robert explained that the 70-30 split was based on contribution to the preservation and management of the estate during the decedent's final years. Legal language. But it meant Margaret took care of him, Thomas didn't. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sick. Because I could see it happening in real time. The way Thomas's jaw tightened. The way Karen's hand moved to his knee. Robert asked if there were any questions. Thomas said, "That's not what he wanted." Robert looked up. Thomas said, "Dad told me in October he wanted it 50-50. Robert said the will was updated in March. Thomas said he wasn't in his right mind in March. I finally spoke. I said, yes, he was. Thomas turned to me. And he said, "You don't know that, Margaret." I said I was there every single day. He was lucid. He knew exactly what he was doing. Thomas leaned back in his chair. He said, "Or maybe you convinced him." That's when I felt it. The shift. The line in the sand. Robert closed the file. He said if Thomas wanted to contest the will, he had the right to do so. Thomas didn't answer. He just stood up. Karen followed. They left without another word. I sat there for 10 minutes after they were gone. Robert asked if I was all right. I said I didn't know. He said, "Your father was very clear about his wishes, Margaret. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." But I already did. Not because I thought I'd done anything wrong, but because I knew my brother. And I knew he wouldn't let this go. 2 weeks later, I got served. A petition to contest the will. Filed in Buncombe County Superior Court. Thomas was claiming undue influence. That I had manipulated Dad while he was sick. Isolated him. Coerced him into changing the will. The petition cited the fact that I was living in the house. That I was present during the signing. That Dad was on pain medication and cognitively impaired. It also mentioned that I had a financial motive. That I'd left my job in Raleigh 2 years earlier. That I was dependent on Dad's support. Every word of it was technically true. And every word of it was a lie. I hired an attorney. A woman named Susan Carver. She had an office in Charlotte. She specialized in estate litigation. She was in her 60s. Sharp. Direct. She read the petition and said, "Your brother's reaching, but that doesn't mean he won't reach far." I asked what that meant. She said, "It means he's going to make this ugly, and you need to be ready for that." The depositions started in June. Thomas's attorney was a man named Philip Rostow. Expensive suit. Expensive watch. The kind of lawyer you hire when you want to win, not when you want the truth. He deposed the hospice nurses. The estate attorney. Dad's doctors. Our Aunt Dorothy. Then he deposed me. It lasted 7 hours. He asked about every conversation I'd had with Dad in the last 2 years. Every financial transaction. Every decision I made on his behalf. He asked if I'd ever suggested Dad change his will. I said no. He asked if I knew I was the primary beneficiary before Dad died. I said no. He asked if I thought it was fair that I received more than twice what my brother received. I said it wasn't about fair. It was about what Dad wanted. He asked if I loved my brother. I paused. I said, I used to. Susan told me later I shouldn't have said that. But I couldn't lie. Not about that. Thomas's deposition happened a week later. I wasn't allowed to attend. But Susan was. She called me that night. She said, he's good. I asked what she meant. She said, he's calm, sympathetic. He talks about your father like he was his best friend. I said, he barely saw him. She said, I know, but the jury won't. That's when I realized. This was going to trial. It wasn't going to settle. Thomas wasn't going to back down. And somewhere along the way, this stopped being about money. It became about something else. Something I didn't have a name for yet. The trial started on a Monday in late September. Buncombe County Courthouse. Judge Phyllis Brennan presiding. The courtroom was half full. I sat behind Susan at the plaintiff's table. Thomas and Karen sat behind Philip at the defense table. We didn't look at each other. Not once. Judge Brennan was in her late 50s. She had a reputation for being fair but tough. She didn't tolerate theatrics. Philip stood up and gave his opening statement. He painted a picture of a vulnerable old man. Sick. Dying. Isolated from his son by a daughter who had her own agenda. He said Thomas loved his father, that he respected his father's wishes, but that those wishes had been corrupted by someone who had access, opportunity, and motive. He said this case wasn't about greed. It was about protecting the integrity of a man's legacy. I sat there and felt my hands go numb. Susan stood up for our opening. She was quieter, simpler. She said Wallace Pritchard knew exactly what he was doing. That he made a choice. A hard choice. But a clear one. She said the evidence would show that Margaret didn't manipulate anyone. She showed up. She sacrificed. And her father rewarded that sacrifice. She said, sometimes love looks like presence, and sometimes the absence of presence speaks louder than any words. The first witness was one of the hospice nurses, a woman named Linda. She was kind, soft-spoken. Philip asked if Dad was on morphine when he signed the will. She said yes. He asked if morphine affects cognitive function. She said it can. He asked if Dad was in pain. She said yes. Susan cross-examined. She asked if Dad was alert when he signed. Linda said yes. She asked if he read the document himself. Linda said yes. She asked if he asked any questions. Linda said he asked if Margaret was taken care of. Mr. Calhoun said yes, and then he signed. That was the first crack. Small, but real. The trial went on for 6 days. Witnesses, documents, medical records, financial statements. And then, on the 5th day, Thomas took the stand. Philip asked him to describe his relationship with his father. Thomas's voice was steady. He said they talked every week. That Dad confided in him. That they had a bond that didn't require daily proximity. He said he respected that I took care of Dad. But that caregiving wasn't the same as understanding what Dad truly wanted. Philip asked him about the October conversation. Thomas said Dad called him. Said he was thinking about the will. That he wanted things fair. 50-50. Equal. Philip asked if Dad ever mentioned changing his mind. Thomas said no. Susan stood up for cross. She asked Thomas how many times he visited Dad in the last 19 months. Thomas said, I don't know, several. She said, twice, Thanksgiving 2022 and February 2023. Is that correct? Thomas hesitated. He said, I had work obligations. She said, did your father ever ask you to come more often? Thomas said, no. She said, did you ever offer? He didn't answer. She asked if he was present when Dad signed the will. He said no. She asked if he was present when Dad died. He said no. She asked if he spoke to his father at all in the 2 weeks before he passed. Thomas looked down. He said, I tried. Margaret said he was sleeping. That was a lie. I felt it in my chest like a stone. Susan said, do you have any evidence of that? Thomas said, I have a text. Susan asked him to show it. He pulled out his phone. He scrolled. He handed it to the bailiff. The text was from me. March 29th. It said, Dad's resting. Can you call back later? Susan read it aloud. Then she pulled up the call log. Thomas had called once. At 9 p.m. Dad had been asleep. Susan said, you called once at 9 at night. Margaret asked you to call back, did you? Thomas said, I don't remember. Susan said, the records show you didn't call again for 4 days. Thomas said nothing. She said, no further questions. I testified the next day. I wore a navy dress. No jewelry except my mother's watch. I didn't want to look like I was performing. Susan asked me to describe the last 2 years. I told the truth. I talked about the hospital visits, the chemo, the nights Dad couldn't sleep, the mornings he couldn't eat. I talked about reading to him, playing cards, sitting with him in silence. I said I didn't ask him to change his will. I didn't even know he had until the reading. Susan asked me about his last words. I repeated them. You've been good to me, Maggie. Don't let them take it from you. Philip cross-examined. He asked if Dad specifically said, the estate. I said no. He asked if he might have been talking about something else. I said I don't think so. He asked if I thought I deserved more than my brother. I said, I think I did what Dad needed. And he made a choice based on that. Philip smiled. He said, so you do think you deserved it? I looked right at him. I said, I think my father had the right to leave his money to whoever he wanted, and I think my brother should respect that. Philip said, even if it means you get nearly $2 billion and he gets $800 million. I said, even then. He said, that doesn't seem fair. I said, fair isn't the same as equal. The courtroom went quiet. Judge Brennan called a recess. I walked out into the hallway. Thomas was standing by the window. Alone. I don't know what made me walk over. Maybe I thought there was still something left to save. I said his name. He turned. I said, this doesn't have to go any further. He said, you're right, you could split it. I said, that's not what Dad wanted. Thomas took a step closer. And he said, Dad was old, Margaret, and you were the only voice in his ear. I felt something break. Not my heart. Something deeper. I said, I was the only person in the room. He said, exactly. And that's when I understood. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about the story. And his story made him the victim. I walked away. I didn't look back. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, I was shaking so hard Susan had to put her hand on my arm. The forewoman stood. Judge Brennan asked if they'd reached a verdict. She said yes. She said they found no evidence of undue influence. The will would stand. I heard Karen gasp. I heard Thomas's chair scrape the floor. But I didn't turn around. Judge Brennan thanked the jury. She dismissed the case. And just like that, it was over. Or so I thought. Because 3 days later, I got a call from Susan. She said, we have a problem. I asked what kind. She said, Thomas filed an appeal, and he's suing you personally for emotional distress and defamation. I sat down. I said, "For what?" She said, "For your testimony, for saying he didn't care for your father." I said, "I didn't say that." She said, "He's claiming you implied it, and that it damaged his reputation." I closed my eyes. Susan said, "Margaret, this isn't about the will anymore." I said, "Then what is it about?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I think he wants to punish you." And that's when I realized this was never going to end. Not with a verdict. Not with a settlement. Because the real wound wasn't about money. It was about something that happened years ago. Something I didn't even realize mattered until now. And if I'm going to explain what comes next, I have to tell you what that moment was. The moment of disrespect. The one that started all of this. The moment of disrespect happened in a hospital room. Not the one where Dad died. This was 6 years earlier. Our mother Elaine was dying. Ovarian cancer. She fought it for 3 years. But by that November, she was in the palliative care unit at Mission Hospital. She was down to 89 pounds. Her voice was a whisper. Thomas and I took turns sitting with her. I had the day shift. He had the evenings. That particular Tuesday, I'd been there since 7 in the morning. Mom was sleeping most of the day. But around 3 in the afternoon, she woke up. She was clear. Sharper than she'd been in weeks. She asked for a glass of water. I helped her sip it. Then she took my hand. And she said, "I need to talk to you about your father." I thought she meant his health. His grief. I said, "He's strong, Mom. He'll be okay." She shook her head. A small, painful movement. She said, "No, about the business." I waited. She said, "He trusts Thomas with the face of it, the handshakes, the deals, but he trusts you with the bones." I didn't understand. She said, "The bones are what hold it up, Maggie. The contracts, the numbers, the truth." She squeezed my hand. She said, "When I'm gone, you have to promise me you'll watch the bones." I promised. I didn't know what else to do. She fell back asleep. Thomas arrived at 6. I was exhausted. I told him Mom had been awake. That she was lucid. He nodded. He was looking at his phone. I said, "She talked about the business." He said, "Okay." I said, "She said Dad trusts you with the face of it, but he trusts me with the bones." Thomas put his phone down. He looked at me. And he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile you give a child who's just said something naive. He said, "Mom's on a lot of medication, Margaret." I said, "She was clear." He said, "She's dying, she says things." I felt a heat rise in my chest. I said, "She wasn't confused." He picked up his phone again. He said, "I'll sit with her, you go get some dinner." I stood there for a second, watching him scroll through emails, while our mother lay dying 6 feet away. That was the moment. The disrespect wasn't just toward me. It was toward her last coherent wish. He dismissed it. He dismissed her. And he dismissed me. I left the room. I didn't come back that night. I drove to Dad's house. He was in the kitchen, making a sandwich. He saw my face and asked what was wrong. I told him what Mom said. I told him what Thomas said. Dad put the knife down. He wiped his hands on a towel. He said, "Your mother's a smart woman." I said, "Is it true?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, at the darkening Blue Ridge Mountains. Then he said, "Thomas is a salesman. He can make people believe in something that doesn't exist yet. That's a gift." I said, "And me?" He turned back to me. He said, "You make sure what does exist doesn't fall apart." That was all. We never spoke of it again. Mom died 4 days later. Thomas gave the eulogy at her funeral, too. It was beautiful. People told him how strong he was. How loving. I stood off to the side, holding the bones. I didn't think about that hospital room again for years. Not until I was sitting in Susan Carver's office in Charlotte. 3 days after the appeal was filed. The personal lawsuit. Emotional distress. Defamation. Susan had the papers on her desk. She said, "He's claiming your testimony painted him as an uncaring son, that it's affected his business relationships, his standing in the community." I said, "What community? He lives in Atlanta." She said, "He's on the board of 2 charities. He's up for a membership at a very exclusive club. Reputation matters." I said, "So this is about a club membership?" Susan leaned forward. She said, "No, this is about him needing to prove something. To you, to himself, maybe to your father's ghost." She tapped the papers. She said, "The appeal will take a year, maybe 18 months. But this personal suit, he can push that faster. And it's a different burden of proof." I asked what she meant. She said, "In the will contest, he had to prove you manipulated your father. That's hard. In this, he just has to prove you said something false that hurt him. That's easier." I felt tired. A deep, cellular tiredness. I said, "What do I do?" Susan sat back. She said, "You have 2 choices. You settle. Give him another 10%. Make it 60-40. Maybe that's enough for his pride." I said, "And choice 2. She said, "You fight. You fight the appeal. You fight the personal suit. You dig in for a war that could last 3 more years. And you understand that by the end of it, there will be nothing left between you. No family. No shared history, just legal bills and bitterness." I looked out her window. At the Charlotte skyline. The buildings my father had probably helped finance. I said, "What would you do?" Susan was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'd ask myself what your mother meant about the bones." I went back to Asheville that night. To Dad's house. My house now. The paperwork had cleared. The assets were transferring. But the house still smelled like him. Like old books and coffee, and the pine-scented soap he used. I walked into his study. The desk was exactly as he left it. Neat. Orderly. I sat in his chair. I looked at the filing cabinet in the corner. I'd been through it a dozen times since he died. Estate documents. Tax records. Old contracts. But I'd never really looked. Not with the right question. I got up. I opened the top drawer. I started pulling files. Not the labeled ones. The ones in the back. The ones tucked behind the hanging folders. My hands found a small, leather-bound notebook. I'd seen it before. Thought it was an old address book. I opened it. It was Dad's handwriting. Dates. Numbers. Initials. It took me a minute to understand. It was a ledger. But not for the business. For something else. Payments. Monthly payments. Going back 12 years. To an account listed only as TAP Trust. The amounts varied. Sometimes $5,000. Sometimes 20. Sometimes 50. The last entry was dated 2 months before he died. $10,000. I flipped to the front of the book. The first entry was January, 12 years ago. Next to it in Dad's tight script, it said, "Start of TAP clean slate." TAP. Thomas Allen Pritchard. My hands went cold. I kept flipping. There were notes. Small ones. Next to some of the payments. Cover shortfall, Q3 bonus missed. Atlanta property tax. Karen's vehicle. Debt consolidation. Club initiation. I closed the book. I held it against my chest. My father had been giving Thomas money. For 12 years. Subsidizing his life. His lifestyle. And Thomas never told me. He sat in that courtroom and let his lawyer talk about my financial motive. My dependency. I put the book back, I closed the drawer. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But I knew it was a bone. And my mother told me to watch the bones. The next morning, I called Susan. I told her about the ledger. She was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, "Where is it?" I said, "In the desk." She said, "Don't touch it. Don't mention it to anyone. I'm sending a forensic documents specialist to you. Today." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because if we're going to use it, we need to authenticate it, and we need to understand what it is." I said, "It's a ledger of payments." She said, "It's more than that, Margaret. It's a pattern. It shows your brother had a financial need. A consistent one. That's motive." Motive for what? I didn't ask. I already knew. Motive to contest the will. Motive to lie. The specialist arrived that afternoon. A woman named Gail. She wore gloves. She photographed every page of the ledger. She examined the binding. The ink. She asked if there were any other notebooks. I said not that I'd found. She packed it in a special case. She said she'd run tests. Check the ink age. Verify the handwriting. She said, "This could be very helpful, or it could be nothing." I said, "It's not nothing." She gave me a sympathetic look. She said, "It's never nothing with families." After she left, I felt restless. I drove to the diner where Dad ate every Sunday. The Blue Ridge Grill. Booths with cracked vinyl. Coffee that was too strong. I sat in his usual booth. The waitress, Darlene, knew me. She brought me coffee without asking. She said, "Haven't seen you in a while." I said, "Been dealing with things." She nodded. She worked here 20 years. She knew Dad. She knew Thomas. She said, "Your brother was in here last week." That surprised me. I said, "Thomas was here." She said, "With a slick-looking guy in a suit, lawyer type. They sat right where you're sitting." I looked down at the table, as if I could see their ghostly impression. Darlene leaned in a little. She said, "They were talking loud enough, I wasn't eavesdropping, but I heard." I didn't ask. I waited. She said, "The lawyer guy said something about discrediting her character. Your brother said, she's always been fragile. After our mom died, she never really recovered." I felt the coffee burn in my throat. Darlene put a hand on her hip. She said, "I always liked you, Margaret. You're quiet, but you're steady. Your dad said that too." She walked away. I sat there, staring at my reflection in the dark window. Fragile. He was going to tell people I was fragile. Unstable. Grieving. To explain why Dad might have changed the will out of pity. Not out of respect. Out of pity. I left money on the table. I drove to the cemetery. I stood at my parents' grave. One headstone. 2 names. Elaine Marie Pritchard. Wallace Henry Pritchard. "He's telling people I'm fragile, Mom," I said to the cold air. The wind picked up. A dry leaf skittered across the grass. I thought about the bones. What else was there? What else had I missed? Susan called me 2 days later. Her voice was different. Tense. She said, "The ledger is authentic. The ink, the paper, the handwriting, it's your father's." I said, "Okay." She said, "That's not all. Gail found something, a pattern in the payments. They increased every time Thomas had a major life event, when he bought the house in Atlanta, when his first child was born, when he joined the board of that charity." I said, "Dad was helping him." Susan said, "Yes, but look at the last 2 years. The payments stopped." I hadn't noticed that. I said, "Stopped." She said, "The last payment was 24 months before your father died. Then nothing." I thought about it. 2 years ago. That's when I moved back to Asheville. When Dad got sick. I said, "Maybe Dad couldn't manage it anymore. I took over his finances." Susan said, "Maybe. Or maybe Thomas asked him to stop, because you were around. And he didn't want you to know. The pieces shifted. A new picture. Thomas had been financially dependent on Dad. Then the support stopped. Then Dad changed his will in my favor. From Thomas's perspective, it must have looked like I'd cut him off. Twice. Susan said, "This changes our strategy for the appeal and the personal suit. We can show his financial vulnerability, his motive to lie." I said, "It feels dirty." She said, "It is dirty, but he started it." That night, I couldn't sleep. I went back to the study. I opened the filing cabinet again. I looked for anything else with TAP. I found it in the bottom drawer. A sealed envelope. With my name on it. In Dad's handwriting. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't seen this before. I must have missed it. I picked it up. It wasn't sealed tightly. The flap was just tucked in. I opened it. A single sheet of paper. Dated 2 months before he died. Maggie. If you're reading this, the boys in suits are probably already circling. Thomas won't let this go easy. He's never been good at losing, especially to you. I need you to understand something. The money I gave him all those years, it wasn't a gift. It was a loan, every penny. He signed promissory notes. I have them. In the safety deposit box at First Citizens. Box 714. Key is in the back of my watch case. I never called them in. I never wanted to. He's my son. But if he pushes this, if he tries to take what I left for you, then the loans come due. All of them, with interest. It's not a threat. It's a choice. His choice. You've always been stronger than you think. Don't let him make you small. Love. Dad. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it carefully. Put it back in the envelope. My hands weren't shaking. They were perfectly still. I went to the bedroom. To the dresser where I kept Dad's watch. A simple silver Rolex. He wore it every day for 40 years. I opened the back of the watch case. A small brass key fell into my palm. I held it. It was warm. I thought about the hospital room. My mother's hand. The bones. I thought about the courtroom. Thomas's lie. I thought about the diner. Fragile. I put the key in my pocket. I didn't call Susan. Not yet. I needed to see what was in that box. I needed to know exactly what my father had left me. Not just the money. The truth. And the weapon.